Okay, we're going to try this again. I did one recording of this already, and the sound decided suddenly not to work, so the microphone wasn't working. All right, so this week we're going to talk about books. In particular, life-changing reads. So I'm going to share with you some books that appeared to have a strong effect on my life, that changed my life. Remember that when we talk magic, we want to challenge the common notion of cause and effect as a horizontal phenomenon of this causing this, okay? And think of things more vertically. So really what happened as I read these books, that as I was reading them, a certain change emerged. So I was reading the book over here, and then a change happened over here, somehow related to that event, not necessarily caused by it, okay? Another way of looking at things like this is that when you are ripe for things to start changing in your life, there can be a sort of catalyst that comes along that triggers that change or has something to do with it. Does not necessarily directly cause it. The reason I'm saying this is because as I present these books and as you look at them, try not to look at them, oh, I should buy that book. That book will change my life. Let's not look at them that way, okay? We'll look at them as possible triggers for changes that are already in the works for you, possibly. Okay, so I make no guarantees about any of these. All right, I'd like to say this was the first book I ever bought on magic, but the first book on magic I ever purchased was actually Aleister Crowley's Magic in Theory and Practice. And didn't have a high opinion of it then. I don't have a high opinion of that book now. Crowley is very interesting, but also challenging to read because he puts up a lot of smoke screens and self-aggrandizing traps for the unwary. All right, so the second book I ever bought on magic was The Art and Practice of Astral Projection by Ophiel. This was probably back in 1986, something like that. And this is a great book because, well, I began practicing the exercise in it right away, and I got results in about a month. And the interesting thing is that it was using the dream method. And the interesting thing is that in the last chapter of this book, there is an introduction to some Golden Dawn techniques and a reference to the Golden Dawn. So I quickly graduated from the practice of this book to various Golden Dawn ceremonial magic disciplines. I highly recommend this book. I think if you get it, you'll be pleasantly surprised or surprised by the style of the author's writing. A hugely impactful book, Dion Fortune's Mystical Qabalah, simply because it's probably the best book on Kabbalah I could recommend. If anyone knows of a better one, put it in the comments down below. Let me know. I'd be interested in it, okay? I have some kosher Kabbalah books. Kosher Kabbalah is the Jewish Kabbalah that are really, really awesome, which I could also recommend, but I'm not going to go into those books here. This is a Hermetic Kabbalah book, which is pretty much the type of Kabbalah that was practiced by the Renaissance magicians and the Golden Dawn. And this was required reading for me when I was in the Golden Dawn in the Neophyte grade. And I spent a great deal of time outlining this in heavy detail. I got like a 90-page outline of this book. Also learned a lot about outlining, how to do that. Oops, I didn't keep up with the slides. Okay, Mystical Qabalah, that was the second book. Another book, The Tree of Life by Israel Regardie. This is a fantastic overview of ceremonial magic, pretty much describing what it is, linking it back to Hermetic magic of the Hellenistic age in Alexandria. Alexandria, where the library burned, ancient Alexandria. And he describes the magic of the Golden Dawn as the same magic as Theurgy. The Theurgy that the magicians of the Hellenistic age practiced. And he relates it back to the magician Iamblichus, which we'll talk about in a bit. Okay, so this is a great overview of ceremonial magic. It doesn't go back to the ultimate roots of magic, just to the roots of magic in Alexandria and in the Hellenistic age. Okay, and sort of from ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. Okay, we will talk about the roots of magic before that in just a wee bit further down the road as we do some other books. This is written by Israel Regardie, the same author. It is the 1-year manual. And he wrote this when he was quite a bit older, and the style here is much more modern. In the book, The Tree of Life, 1-year manual, in The Tree of Life, the style is very much heavily influenced by the Victorian authors that Regardie himself had probably read. And so it was very flamboyant style of writing, which I happen to like. I think it's fantastic. He's pretty good with words. Here, the style is much more clean, straightforward, modernized. It's still good. He's still a good writer when he does that. This book was very impactful for me because it has an exercise in it. It's got numerous exercises. These exercises are basically designed to get you a spiritual experience within 1 year. It's like he makes a promise, right? And one of the exercises in this book I found particularly powerful, and that was the practice of the presence of God. It's a pore breathing exercise where you visualize your body as covered in pores that are breathing along with your breathing exercise. I've already gone over that exercise in a couple of previous videos. And I discuss it in depth in an article in Forbidden Realms. That article is called The Insanity of Geometry. Okay, I go in depth into the sort of pore breathing exercise. Very powerful. Some of you have told me it's extremely powerful as well. It's a great exercise for putting you further down the path on the road to enlightenment. And another one that was very impactful for me is The Alchemical Tarot. This book came with a tarot deck, and that tarot deck is a collector's item now. It's on sale at the local occult bookstore here in South Florida where I live. I think it's like $250 for the book and the tarot deck. And you can see his style is very clean, almost like stained glass, but not stained glass. It's got a very clean style of tarot. That's not nearly the best card right there. There are other cards that are spectacular in the deck. But the main impact of this deck for me was the booklet that came with it. It's fairly substantial. And it describes alchemy in terms of the trumps of the tarot. Okay, this is a psychological interpretation of alchemy. And as I've said in a previous video, I tend to view alchemy psychologically. I am well aware that many of the descriptions in alchemy do describe what physically happened in a laboratory. So that's all very interesting. But when Carl Jung explored alchemy, he wasn't trying to rebrand it as psychological work that we can undergo spiritually, let's say. He was simply delving into the psychological dimensions of the work that the alchemists were doing. And what he uncovered was that this kind of work can be done without a laboratory, without working with sulfur or mercury or antimony or things like that. This book gave me the first clear understanding of what alchemy seems to be about in regards to sulfur, mercury, and salts. Those ideas. Alchemy can be very difficult to study because there are different takes on it. There are different symbols that refer to the same thing. Alchemy is actually quite simple in its essence and can be extremely complicated in its literature. I do go quite a bit into alchemy in my Forbidden Realms articles, particularly when I talk about sexual tantra. Those articles have quite a bit of basic alchemy in them, and some direct pointing teachings too, in regard to alchemy and sexual tantra. Okay, there's quite a lot of reveals in that article too about the nature of sexuality and what's really required for tantric work. This book was really impactful to me, mainly because any of his books are pretty good when it comes to understanding Qabalah. Okay, Zev ben Shimon Halevi, also known as Warren Kenton. I think he's a British guy. He probably adopted the pseudo Jewish name maybe to lend more credibility to himself as an author about Qabalah. Maybe, I don't know. But this describes a human being in terms of the four worlds. Okay, more than that. Okay, quite in depth. Is it accurate when it describes anatomy and things like that? Not necessarily. There's some medical things in here that are outdated. Doesn't really matter because what you're learning here is how to work with a system of correspondences in the Qabalah. Okay. I was required to also outline this book in depth, so I studied it quite intensely. And if you want Qabalah to be something that you realize in your bones, as opposed to just intellectually, working with books like this and studying them in depth can really be helpful. And this one was particularly helpful to me. Yeah, and it is not... This is what I would still consider this to be Hermetic Qabalah, not necessarily the kosher style Qabalah. I do have some Jewish texts in Qabalah. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, I would recommend getting some commentaries on the Zohar or on Lurianic Qabalah, if you're interested in that kind of stuff. Lurianic Qabalah is truly mind-blowing. Another really valuable text, Theurgy and the Soul. So as Regardie was talking about, magic, ceremonial magic and its very formal style comes from its roots in cities like Alexandria and in the Hellenistic age. Basically lots of Greek deities and priests learning how to invoke them, how to animate statues with them, supposedly. Learning how to transform themselves to become more divine, more godlike. Okay, Theurgy literally means God working. Okay, this is a fantastic book for that. But still, it doesn't get to the ultimate roots of magic. Where does magic really come from? Magic was already existing in the city of ancient Alexandria, and so it came into that city and got refined by people who knew a lot about Greek philosophy and the Egyptian religion. It's a bit of a misnomer to say the Egyptians had a religion. Okay, we'll talk about that in a bit. What is religion and what is magic? Prometheus Rising. If you like having your mind blown, this book becomes highly recommended. Robert Anton Wilson is the author. He was a friend of Timothy Leary. He was also a friend of my teacher, who knew them both. And you get a lot of Timothy Leary's psychology in this book, as sort of a framework, but you get a lot of Robert Anton Wilson's incredible wit as well. And he takes a lot of your standard everyday assumptions about the world and pretty much blasts them to bits, turns them inside out, turns them upside down, and you're not sure what reality is anymore when Wilson is done with you. So a really good read. Not so shocking to me anymore. After I saw this one, I thought, well, I've got it now. I've got the nature of reality. Well, there are further books that came along that kept challenging some of my assumptions about reality, and I'll share those with you too. All right, this is one of them. Revisioning Psychology. Sorry about the glare there. Kind of hard to see. James Hillman is the author. James Hillman is the father of archetypal psychology, depth psychology. He's essentially a Jungian analyst, scholar, neo-Jungian, you could say, and quite a giant in his field. And this book heavily criticizes everything that had been done in psychology up until his day. So in other words, it really tears apart a lot of the assumptions that have been made by psychologists, a lot of the errors that they make. It's quite a mind-blowing book. And as he does that, he pretty much challenges a lot of the standard narratives that have been screwing up psychology. And those standard narratives are the essence of your worldview. So your worldview also will come tumbling down if you read this book. Okay, probably. It certainly did with me, and I still value reading him very highly. You can always get something out of this book, something you can keep around and come back to. This next book I should warn you about. It's part of what I call the Success Club. So there are many self-help authors, self-transformation authors, business authors, biohacking authors who give you techniques for leveling up, improving your productivity, getting an edge over your competition, getting some extra mojo, all these kinds of things. Biohack your brain to become smarter than everybody else, okay? A lot of these things are geared towards making you stand out in relation to others. It's all well and good, that's fine, okay? Just remember that you can sort of get addicted to this maximize your performance perspective. So when it comes to looking at your mind-body, try to be more respectful to it than some of these authors are, okay? And don't try to extract as much out of it as you possibly can. Don't try to extract as much profit out of your mind and body as you can, okay? Your mind and body are not your slaves, okay? There is no you really anyway. So who's this master who's risen above mind and body, trying to maximize the yield it gets from these things, okay? So be very careful with these types of books that hack your performance, okay? That being said, this is fantastic because, you know, wisdom and charisma are sort of the same entity. They're just sort of different sides of the same coin. And Olivia Fox Cabane explores charisma as not necessarily something that you're born with, because that's the standard belief, but it's something that you can learn, as a skill that you can learn. And the cool thing is, as you learn these charisma tricks, you learn how to become more charming, more magnetic, a more powerful leader. You also learn a lot about human nature and your own fears and your own psychological blocks, things like that. So it's a fantastic book for that. And it's always nice to be more charming, right? Okay, so yeah, it's a life-changing book. The techniques presented in here, some of them are not hard at all. They're super easy to do, and they get very quick results. I talk about the charisma myth in the article called "How to Project Power," in the Forbidden Realms. I also talk a little bit about the alpha male, alpha female phenomenon, like what's a true alpha male or a true alpha female really like? What kind of behaviors do they exhibit? Okay, you might want to check that out. To learn magic, it's essential that you know mythology. There are mythologies that are governing you right now as we speak. They have you hypnotized and you're probably not even aware of them. Even if you weren't raised Christian, there are many Christian philosophies embedded in our Western culture that are pretty much lording over you right now and controlling your behavior. There are values that are implanted, images that are implanted in you by your upbringing, whether it's religious or not, that you get these kinds of values programmed into you, and they just kind of run, and you're not even aware that you have a choice. That's the Christian myth. Okay, there are other myths as well that are also percolating around the world and pretty much taking people over, controlling their behavior. The more you become aware of these myths, the less they are able to control you. Okay, it's kind of like every myth has a particular framework or perspective associated with it, or a number of perspectives. Okay, so to learn about myth, should go to the granddaddy of all mythologists, Joseph Campbell. The Power of Myth I recommend because it's an easy read. It's actually put together by Bill Moyers, who interviewed Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell himself is a difficult read. Okay, he's got a very cumbersome way of writing sometimes. If you're feeling really clever, then he's okay. But if you haven't had any coffee, then maybe wait till later to read Joseph Campbell. If you like a challenging read, I recommend Joseph Campbell's entire series, The Masks of God. Okay, particularly primitive mythology and creative mythology, those two, for magical purposes, for magical learning stuff about magic. There's also a book written by Campbell himself without Bill Moyers. It's called Transformations of Myth Through Time. That's pretty accessible, not too difficult to read. That's another one I recommend. Okay, this is probably the easiest, a nice introduction to Joseph Campbell and his life work. He explored so many myths of the world's major and minor cultures, and he showed how there is a sort of biological, psychological, and underlying unity to them all. Yeah, there's another book I could recommend. There's another book called Wired for Story, which I also might recommend. The reason why we like stories. There's some biological and instinctive reasons why. There's neuroscience behind it. So yeah, that's interesting. This is more of a psychological, like Jungian, Freudian look at mythology, but you could also do another book called Wired for Story. I didn't put that on here, but that just came to mind. All right, the Holy Grail. I make several references to the Holy Grail in my articles. I think in the Qabalah Magic book too. I think it's a very important subject. This book. Some of you book collectors are going to cry when they see this because I tend not to keep the jackets of books. So there it is. The Holy Grail by Malcolm Godwin. This is a fantastic book. There's the cover. It has every couple of pages is a single article, and so you can read one of these per day, pretty much. Yeah. How's that go? You can read like one of these every single day. You can see it's beautifully illustrated. And this goes into all aspects of the Grail. It goes into the pagan roots, pagan origins, It goes into the stone that fell from heaven, which I do talk about in my Forbidden Realms article called The Philosopher's Stone. And it goes into the Christianization of the Grail myth and the Arthurian cycle of the Grail. It also tells you what the Grail is. I also tell you that too in some of my articles on Forbidden Realms. All right, this book. So the kind of teachings that I think all of us value the most in regard to spirituality are direct pointing teachings. There's a famous saying by Lao Tzu that says, those who know do not speak, and those who speak do not know. And we tend to interpret that as, well, if you're talking, then you're talking crap, basically, right? Because you don't know anything. Those who know keep silent about what they know. No, that's not necessarily true. What that means is that primarily, if you are talking about something, the thing that you know is not in those words. Okay, so the language you're using cannot really capture what you're talking about if you're talking about the true nature of reality. Okay, however, your words can lead your listener into certain states and certain images and things like that that point to the nature of reality. Okay, it's very important. So those who speak aren't really talking directly about what they know. They're indirectly talking about what they know. They're pointing at it. Okay, so when somebody talks about the true nature of reality, don't pick apart their words. Try to look where they're pointing. Okay, and so this guy is astonishingly good at direct pointing teachings. Lama Tubten Yeshe. He died not too long ago. He was a living Buddha, as far as I'm concerned. There are others that are still alive that are supposedly enlightened, like he was. This is not a particularly appealing cover. I understand why there are so many books with Tibetan masters on the cover like this, photos of them. If you've ever met somebody who's enlightened, their presence is life-changing. They don't even have to say anything. And so somebody probably, met this guy and thought that putting his picture on the cover would have the same impact that this person has in person, that Lama Yeshe has in person. But yeah, could have been a better cover. Fantastic book. I really like the Mahamudra form of Tibetan Tantra. It's a form of Buddhism that is considered supposedly the most advanced. Not really. It's simply the most effective form of Buddhism that there is. Yes, people do have to be ripe for it. They have to be ready for it, and often they're not ready. But there are intermediate or earlier forms of Mahamudra practice that you can work through in order to get to essence Mahamudra. And this guy's really good about talking about how to meditate and what happens when meditation brings you to the brink of enlightenment. He describes it very well. It's a little difficult at points because the true nature of reality is very subtle, but he manages very well to point out sort of where it's going. This is a great survey. This is also a Buddhist. It's The Secret of the Vajra World by Reginald Ray. Okay, it's a survey of the most advanced practices in Buddhism. He's got two other books before this that talk. The first one talks about the Theravada school of Buddhism. That's kind of Buddhism as the Buddha taught it in his time. And then there's the Mahayana school of Buddhism that he talks about in the second book. And in the third book, he talks about the Tantrayana or the Vajrayana school of Buddhism, which is the magical forms of Buddhism that involve ritual, visualization, powerful voice techniques. Very similar to Golden Dawn magic. Okay, so fantastic book if you gravitate towards Buddhism, especially the magical forms of Buddhism. Buddhism not as a religion necessarily, but as a discipline, spiritual discipline. And so I don't have the power of now. I loaned it to somebody, and I'm not sure who it was. So there's the cover. A very transformative book for many, many people. For me, it was not that big a deal. Many of the insights I already had, but the biggest deal for me came in the first few pages when he describes his enlightenment experience, when Eckhart Tolle describes the night that he achieved enlightenment. He basically describes what I call a letting go attack. And in his case, he had a letting go attack that completely allowed him to surrender. And so his ego died, and then he emerged from that experience supposedly enlightened. And if you see videos of him when he, especially when he was younger, radiant, very radiant presence, very humorous, very reassuring, very kind, very got a twinkle in the eye. Interesting presence. He's getting kind of old now. He's still a very compelling teacher even now, though. And One Spirit Medicine, another book where the jacket has come off. Sorry, guys. One Spirit Medicine. This one really made a big impact on my life because it led me into biohacking. And earlier I said, well, where does religion, where does magic originally come from? Okay. Regardie was saying sort of that ceremonial magic came out of Alexandria, out of Theurgy, and the practices of Iamblichus. No, magic obviously came from much earlier than that. It was pretty much practiced by shamans, by our hunter-gatherer ancestors, by the animistic worldview. Okay, and once I read some of Campbell, I read some of Joseph Campbell, and I started to get an inkling about what happened between religion and magic, and it's like, that can't be right. And then once I read One Spirit Medicine, it confirmed for me it is correct. So apparently, what happened when civilization developed, the shamans were really quite a pain to deal with because they weren't interested in maintaining civil order in a city-state. They were interested in, contact with the ancestral spirits or the gods or the spirits of the land. And that didn't have much to do with a civil order, which is basically hell-bent on maintaining control and exploiting the citizenry to make wealth for the overlord. Okay, I'm not saying that's all there is to civilization, but that's largely what was happening. And of course, when the king of a city-state became annoyed with the shamans because they weren't submitting to his rule of law, he would have them, banished or killed. But the people wanted their shamans. They wanted their spirituality. So not only did he banish and kill the shamans which were causing trouble, he replaced them with priests. So rather than have a religious figure that developed organically out of the nature, sort of spontaneously, naturally, we just kill them or banish them, and then we replace them with somebody who pretends to be a priest of nature, but they're actually a priest of the city-state. And then everything becomes about morality and maintaining order and becoming a good servant to your king. All right. Why am I bringing this up? Well, because One Spirit Medicine talks about how to get healthy again. When we started living in cities and being cut off from nature, our bodies were not getting the right signals from the food, from the water, from the air, from the sun exposure, from the cold exposure, from the heat exposure. our bodies were not getting the right conditioning anymore, and our habits were also out of sync with nature. That was making us sick. What did people do when they were getting sick back in the city-state days? The shaman, if he was banished, lived outside of town, outside of the city. You would go to the shaman, and the shaman would say, well, what have they done to you behind the walls of that city? Stop eating that. You're eating porridge. That's really terrible food. It gives you some energy for a little while so you can do some work, but then you're totally trashed by the end of the day, right? Here, have some real food. Give you some herbs, give you some fat from a fresh kill. We'll give you vegetables and roots. And not only that, but you're going to sleep outside in the cold. You're going to expose yourself to the cold. You're going to take a bath in the river, in the clean water of nature. We're going to walk in the rain. We're going to get back in touch with the goddess and the various spirits of the land. And lo and behold, your health will come back. And well, then you go back into the city, you work for a while, and you work in that oppressive environment, get sick again, and then you go out and get cured by the shaman again, hopefully. So very interesting. So here, Alberto Villoldo presents ways, pretty much this kind of signals that we are missing from nature. A lot of it is in the diet, okay, but also in regard to, getting enough sunshine directly on the skin. Yes, sunlight is good for you. Getting heat and cold exposure. Okay, all these things are good triggers for the body to maintain its health. Okay. Lots of other things. He talks a lot about diet, especially like a paleo diet, things like that. All right. The Secret Teachings of Plants. This one I don't have in a physical copy. I have it in an e-copy. There's a picture of the cover. This is an astonishingly good book where Stephen Harold Buhner does his best to try to convey to us what it's like to be a shaman who's in direct communication with the plant world. And he would say that the really good herbalists way back when we lived out in nature, could learn how to cure ailments by talking to plants, by listening to them, by sitting with them, by learning from their examples. Plants are pretty amazing. There's another good book called The Secret Life of Plants, which is also mind-blowing. Apparently, plants have a whole electromagnetic sensory system, and so if you take a plant and you break it in half in the presence of another plant that's like it appears to become stressed. It gets stressed out. There's a spike in its energy, in its electric energy. So apparently it's possible for humans to communicate that way. And many of the cures that our shaman ancestors had that came from roots and plants and things like that, even recipes, supposedly were taught directly by the plants. Does that sound really far-fetched? Read the book. It's a great deal of science to it. Some of it seems a bit wishful thinking, but of course you have to try some of the things he's talking about. This book really changed my life in regard to breathing. It actually has had me revise the breathing techniques in the Qabalah Magic book. Yeah. The revision to those breathing techniques you could find in my article on breathing techniques to restore primal health, I think it's called. One of the articles in Forbidden Realms. And this is a book on freediving, essentially about how to hold your breath and dive really deep. It's also a book about how to equalize your ears so you can dive really deep. And so there's lots of stuff in here about how to do that, like, running on a treadmill to get yourself used to, and holding your breath while you're running to get yourself used to more carbon dioxide so you can hold your breath longer, things like that. I discovered this book before I got over my fear of swimming underwater. I had hydrophobia. and I was born with it apparently. And I picked up this book in the oceanography section of the bookstore, and when I began reading it, I actually started to cry a little bit. And it was so beautiful what he was describing about what happens to a freediver when he dives without a tank of oxygen on his back, and what the physiological changes that come over the body, and what that does to your mind when you go deep into the water like that. And apparently humans do have a diving reflex, which we share with other mammals. And when that diving reflex is triggered, it's very, I don't know, Zen-like. You're in the zone. You're one with the ocean. Not really possible to describe what that's like. And it can happen even in relatively shallow water, like I don't know, 15 feet deep or so. But maybe 30 feet and greater would be, even stronger effect on your dive reflex. Fantastic for learning how to breathe, to reduce anxiety. And interesting thing is the diet that's proposed in the Alberto Villoldo book, One Spirit Medicine, combined with the breathing techniques in this, I think could cure you of anxiety permanently once you learn these things and adopt them. And we have one fiction book, okay? I'm a huge fan of, first of all, I'm a huge fan of J.R.R. Tolkien. He is my favorite author. Don't want to go into that because I could go on for an hour about J.R.R. Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings and things like that. Interview with the Vampire. Funny thing is I have the book right here, but my webcam is attached to it, so I can't show it to you. So there is the cover. This is such an intense book. It's truly a classic. It's so beautiful for its prose. So you want to think of the way of a romantic, evil, seductive vampire would speak. That's Anne Rice's style. And this book is a really good example of that. She spreads it on really thick. And not only that, but the two characters in it, the vampire Lestat and the vampire Louis, are amazing characters. One of them is sort of a hedonist, thinks he knows a lot about the world because he seeks pleasure and he's really involved in the underworld of partying and sex and things like that, and of course vampirism. And he becomes sort of mentor to Louis, who's a new vampire. And Louis is very much sentimental and moralistic, sort of Catholic in nature, and can't seem to let go of his human sentiment, and can't seem to bring himself to kill to survive. And so the very interesting dynamic forms as Lestat, the vampire Lestat, tries to teach Louis how to kill, how to be a predator. And there are a lot of disturbing parallels between somebody who thinks they know a lot about the world and they develop a cutthroat business attitude or a hedonistic pleasure-seeking attitude, and they think that's what life is all about, and they try to teach that to somebody else. And all of there's some good stuff in that and some bad stuff in that, and of course all of the irony that comes out with that. And Anne Rice explores that so brilliantly, and the vampire metaphor makes it all the more potent. And finally, there's a book on poetry. This book was so impactful to me because it pretty much introduced me to what Romanticism is. I already sort of knew it. I didn't have a word for it. And so this book takes us through a series of poems from pre-Enlightenment to the Enlightenment period. By Enlightenment, I mean the rational Enlightenment of René Descartes, which overtook Europe, in which they thought science was going to cure everything, and analyzing everything with our heads was going to be enough for figuring out the entire universe. That's the sort of enlightenment that happened during the 1600s. And that post-Renaissance, and then after that, in response to that movement, the Enlightenment, the Romantics came about, where they criticized that and railed against it and said, no, the older values of the soul and the heart are the most important thing, not the head. And so he takes us through some poems that existed during the intellectual Enlightenment period, and then some poems that existed during the Romantic period, and we get to see the difference. And of course, magic, the practice of magic, is very much a romantic pursuit. Okay, not romantic with a small r, as in, oh, he's so romantic. More like romantic with a capital R, like, Edgar Allan Poe writing, William Blake. Okay, mythological appeals in art. The romantic worldview essentially is this, that your imagination is not inside your brain. Okay, your imagination is not inside you. You are inside the imagination. Okay, that's essentially the romantic worldview. According to the empirical philosophy of the Enlightenment, that's preposterous. And some of you listening to this might think that's ridiculous. That's impossible. Is it? All right, so that was 20 books that could possibly have something to do with the changing your life. Remember, just reading one of these books isn't necessarily going to change you that much, but of course, if you're ripe for change, some huge things can happen. Okay, yeah, I've got. I might do some more of these. I've got about 1,000 books. I've got over 1,000 books, literally. I really do. So might be some more videos like this if you guys like it. In fact, you can ask me, if you want to see some more of the biohacking stuff, or you want to see more of the magic stuff, just let me know. All right. Until next time.